Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. This morning, we're going to continue our reading and discussion of this little book, this valuable little book entitled The Origin of Futurism and Preterism. Origin of Futurism and Preterism. Now, yesterday, we were discussing these events in history that seem to lend credence to the fulfillment, the divine fulfillment of Daniel's futurist interpretation of, rather the Roman Catholic Church's futurist interpretation of Daniel's prophecy. And before we begin, I want to remind the listeners, this is important for us to understand this before we continue this discussion. If you read Daniel chapter 9 from the top to the bottom, you'll find that Daniel was on his knees in the Babylonian captivity with all the Jews. He was on his knees praying to God for forgiveness, confessing his own sins and the sins of his people. And immediately, as soon as his knees hit the floor, God sent the Archangel Gabriel to come and give him a revelation that the Messiah would come, and gave a precise timing for his coming. After 69 weeks of years, 9 weeks were broken into two parts. First, 7 weeks of years, or 49 years, and then 62 weeks. Now, altogether making 69 weeks of years, 483 years altogether, and then beginning the 70th week of Daniel, the 70th and final week of that 70-week prophecy, Messiah would come. Okay? It's a perfect timeline. It was fulfilled exactly in history. And that last 7-year period of time, that 70th and final week of Daniel's prophecy, was when Jesus would make a covenant, his own blood, for the Jews, Jerusalem. And in the midst of that week, he would confirm that covenant by offering himself as the sacrificial lamb for all who would receive him. Okay? And then from that point, 3.5 years later, Spirit-filled apostles and disciples continued to confirm that covenant, that blood covenant with the Jews and Jerusalem. And at the end of that time, when it was apparent that the Jews and Jerusalem would not receive him, then the gospel went to the Gentiles, and that 490-year period, that 70-week prophecy, was completely and perfectly fulfilled. All right, if you read Daniel's prophecy and then read the New Testament to confirm that the New Testament is the historical record of the perfect and complete fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy in Jesus Christ, then neither preterism or futurism can be the truth. Okay? Preterism asserts the Antichrist was someone of the old pagan Roman Empire, an empire that was virtually about to crumble at the time of Jesus, and that Antichrist would be done away with just shortly after Christ's crucifixion. Now, history leaves it absolutely certain that the Antichrist of the Bible could not be of the old pagan Roman Empire, because the old pagan Roman Empire never really died. It just morphed into the Holy Roman Empire under the Caesar that is now called the papacy. Okay? We know this because Daniel prophesied 4 kingdoms before Christ's return: Babylonian, the Medo-Persian, the Grecian, and finally, the 4th and final empire would be the Roman. The Roman Empire. Okay? Did the Roman Empire really die? Has Christ returned? That's the question you need to ask yourself. Has Christ returned? No. So the Roman Empire is still in power. Now, if it's not the pagan Roman Empire, which it's not, it must be the Christian Roman Empire, the papal Roman Empire. He who calls himself the vicar of Christ, the replacement of the Son of God, who calls himself the Caesar, the all-powerful power of the Roman Empire. And that the only thing that was holding his rise to power, withholding his rise to power, was the ancient pagan Roman Empire, the Caesars. And when they ceased to exist, the man of sin stood up in his place. The papal Caesar stood up in his place. So the restrainer of 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 7, he who now letteth, was the Caesars. He was then in power at the time of Paul's prophecy. And when he was taken out of the way, then indeed that man of sin was revealed, the son of perdition, the one that would deceive the whole world and persecute the saints of the Most High and think to change times and laws. He's done all of that. The Roman Catholic Pope has done all of that. So the Antichrist has been in the world ever since the rise of the papacy. The papacy is, was, and always will be the Antichrist. Jesus is the Christ. The papacy is the Antichrist, the counterfeit Christ. Now, the papacy, in order to preserve itself from the accusation that it and it alone is the Antichrist, has to come up with alternative interpretations of Daniel's prophecy, putting the onus of Antichrist either on someone of the pagan Roman Empire that fell before the papacy's rise, or someone in the way off distant future just a few years before Christ returns. Preterism is that Roman Catholic teaching that says the Antichrist died with Caesars, and that is now the prerogative of the papacy, the vicar of Christ, the replacement of the Son of God, the great Roman Caesar, established the Christian kingdom, the kingdom of Christ. Okay, and we're to worship and obey the Pope in Christ's stead. The Futurists, however, believe that Antichrist is a figment of the future, a single individual, they assert, and that he will come and rebuild the temple. He will cause animal sacrifices and oblations to be reinstituted for a 7-year period of time, and then in the midst of that period of time, he will cause the sacrifices and oblations to cease. Read the New Testament, you find out Jesus is the one who caused the sacrifices and oblations to cease when he gave up the ghost and died and said, "It is finished." What was he talking about? Daniel's prophecy. That's what he was talking about. It is finished. He made the covenant. He confirmed the covenant in his blood. And when he said it's finished, it's finished. And in confirmation of that finishing work of Christ on the cross, his Father ripped the veil of the temple from top to bottom. Okay? And that curtain, when it fell open, exposed the Holy of Holies. Well, no one was allowed prior to that time to go into the Holy of Holies with that veil, without that veil being intact. Anyone who entered the Holy of Holies, but the high priest of Israel once a year to make atonement for the sins of the people, was killed. So all of a sudden, there can be no more animal sacrifices. There can be no more bloodshed. The lamb had been slain. It was finished. Jesus simply declared there is no more sin, no more sacrifice for sin. You either take me or leave me. And that's what the Jews decided to do, to leave him. Now, whether they sewed that veil back up, put it back up, sewed it back together, and began animal sacrifices again, we know one thing, that God would not accept them. certainly after his Son had redeemed man and had undone the curse of Adam, being the second Adam, there would be no more use for sacrifices and oblations by the Jewish priesthood. We're out of a job. Now, rather than go to the unemployment line, they simply propped themselves back up and began to continue the animal sacrifices, which at that point would have been an abomination before the Lord. It's as much as saying we don't accept the blood of God's lamb, we only wish to sacrifice lambs and goats and sheep and pigeons and doves. They didn't get it. Okay? And since they didn't get it, and since they persisted to offer animal sacrifices, God used the Roman 10th Legion to destroy that temple so that not even one stone remained upon the other, putting a permanent end to animal sacrifices. Put a permanent end of any sacrifice. Now, what does that do to Roman Catholicism that says the Mass is a sacrifice? Bloodless it may be, they still call it a sacrifice wherein grace is infused. Okay? It's no different. The Roman Catholic Church offering that sacrifice on their altar called the Mass is no different than a Jew flaying a lamb and offering its blood in an altar that no longer exists. Okay, it's a rejection of Christ. It's nothing. There's nothing Christian about it. Truly believe that Christ is the Lamb and redeemed us with His own blood, then what good is it to shed the blood of an innocent animal? What good is it to offer a man-made piece of bread and a cup of wine as a sacrifice? It's simply saying Jesus was no sufficient sacrifice, that the sacrificial system must continue. Okay? Nothing but error. Now, the papacy wants the whole world to participate in these sacrifices, as though Christ never died. And it wants to fulfill, again, since Daniel's prophecy heralded the Messiah, and the Roman Catholic Church and the papacy is the Antichrist and doesn't want Christ to rule, but he himself wants to rule, then they have to have a do-over of the 70th week of Daniel. They have to create, by human effort, an apparent refulfillment of the 70th week of Daniel. Well, if you read the 70th week of Daniel, you have to understand that there must be a modern nation state of Israel established, and there must be Jews living in the land, there must be a Jewish priesthood, and there must be a Jewish temple, or no sacrifices and oblations can begin. And that's where we get the modern nation state of Israel. The papacy, in conjunction with the kings of the earth, have together in unison and in cooperation dummied up a future fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy. And they know that it's not Christ that's going to fulfill that prophecy. They've rejected him, so they put the onus of this fulfillment on an Antichrist that's going to do this. Okay? What started out from Daniel, a prophecy of the coming of the Messiah and the covenant that he would confirm with his own blood, thus forever ending animal sacrifices, is not going to be fulfilled by Jesus Christ. It's going to be fulfilled by a future Antichrist. Now you can't get more opposite than this. These two scenarios. One suggests that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, the Redeemer of the world, the one who reconciled the world to God and washed away sins, put away sins. And the other suggests that the Messiah has not come. Can't have it two ways. But the world now believes that the futurist interpretation of Daniel's prophecy is correct. It's simply beyond my ability to articulate how deceived the Christian world is. Anyone who reads Daniel's prophecy, studies Daniel's prophecy, making sure not to add anything or take anything away from it, and then read the New Testament and see it perfectly and completely fulfilled in Jesus Christ, must scratch his head and wonder, then why are they talking about a future 70th week of Daniel? Well, I've got the answer. For one reason alone. And that is to create phony antichrist to fulfill this prophecy, this man-made interpretation of Daniel's prophecy, and cause sacrifices and oblations to cease in a rebuilt Jewish temple, in a rebuilt Jewish homeland. And then once he's taken out of the way, then the papacy is free and clear, finally shed completely of the onus of Antichrist, and now must be received by the whole world as the Christ. That's Rome's purpose in all of this. And first we had Theodore Herzl, a Jew, demanding a homeland for the persecuted Jews, Jews that were not intent at all to go back to Israel, because God kicked them out, destroyed their temple, because they had angered God. They knew that the only way they could ever go back to Israel is if God led them there with his right hand, just like he brought them out of Egypt. So Theodore Herzl had a tall order to convince the Jews they ought to go back to, they ought to have their own nation. See, Theodore Herzl to the Jews was not God, and he was not God's right-hand man, and he was not going to lead the Jews back to any homeland, whether it be the ancient nation of Israel or somewhere else in the world. So there had to be an incentive. Change the Jews' mind. And in came, at the same time, the Scofield Reference Bible that seems to indicate that it would be God's purpose to fulfill a future 70th week of Daniel. The Scofield Reference Bible, published in 1907, and then immediately thereafter, the Balfour Declaration, establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine for the Jews, and immediately thereafter the British forces liberated Palestine from the Turks, and they even conquered Jerusalem. And now the rise of Antichrist figures. Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, you name them all, the Axis powers were, to the man, Roman Catholic. They were papal servants, these Antichrist figures. And then in 1948, just 3 years after the war, Israel was declared a homeland for the Jews. And the whole world was convinced, the whole Christian world was convinced that God did all this. That this was the hand of God, that this was the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy. And we even have the United Nations, the world government, over which the papacy has observer status, high, lofty, and above the UN, the observer of the UN global government, partitioning Palestine and forming the Israeli state. And then, some 20 years later, the Israeli forces occupied the city of Jerusalem. All of a sudden, they have their ancient homeland, they have their ancient capital. And all the Christian world is just swooning as though God is fulfilling all these prophecies, when in fact, it is the papacy, the true man of sin, the son of perdition, in cooperation with the governments of the world, including the government of Israel itself, all for the purpose of dummying up a phony counterfeit fulfillment of Daniel's 70-week prophecy, which was fulfilled by Messiah Jesus perfectly and completely 2,000 years ago, and all for the purpose of seating the papacy as King of Kings and Lord of Lords in this world. But still, there's no temple in which to offer sacrifices. There's no 7-year peace treaty to allow the Jews to begin animal sacrifices. And there's been no rapture, a highly anticipated and prayed for event that does not exist in Scripture. Now, it ought to be apparent to my listeners that God's not fulfilling these prophecies, or they would have been fulfilled perfectly and on time, completely, just as the real prophecy of Daniel was fulfilled 2,000 years ago by Jesus the Messiah. The papacy and all the kings of the earth, all the king's horses and all the king's men just can't seem to put Humpty Dumpty together again. There's a few hitches in their futurist get-along. Things just aren't going according to plan. And why? Because God's not in it. Satan and all his powers of deception and all of his control of the governments of the world, including the UN, including the papacy, just can't seem to get their act together. And Futurism is starting to realize, the people who hold the futurist belief are beginning to realize there's something really wrong. We should have been gone a long time ago, say the rapturists and the dispensationalists. We should have been raptured out of here a long time ago. But we're still here. And so what are they doing? Instead of abandoning Futurism and studying their Bibles and studying history and determining that the historicist school of Bible prophecy interpretation is the correct one, they just want to continue engaging in a war of words against the preterists. So we have two abject errors arguing with one another, determining who is right and who is wrong. Kind of goes back to the analogy I gave the other day of mom and dad told little son Johnny, keep your mitts out of the cookie jar. We won't have any cookies till after supper tonight. You keep out of that cookie jar. And Johnny, being Johnny, just couldn't keep out of the cookie jar, so he got into the cookie jar. And then when he was approached and accused of taking cookies out of the cookie jar, Johnny told Mommy, well, I was up in the shower. I was up in the bathtub. I couldn't have taken them. So Mom, checking out his alibi, goes upstairs. There's no moisture in the shower. The shower curtain's dry. The floor is dry. The bar of soap is dry. There isn't any damp towels and wash rags in the hamper. Clearly, no one has used the shower in a day. And when that lie doesn't suffice, Mom questioned it again. He said, oh, I forgot I was down to Jimmy's house. So Dad's on the phone and calls Jimmy's house. Come to find out, Jimmy's family's been out of town for 2 weeks on vacation. And here they're confronted with Johnny with cookie crumbs and chocolate chips all over his face. And Mom and Dad are arguing back and forth which alibi is correct, nearly coming to blows. And when the truth is self-evident. We'll be back right after this.
Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening. Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio, and if you'd like to support Inquisition Update, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors it. If you'd like to contact me, please do so by email. My email address is tom@seawaves.us. Website is inquisitionupdate.org. Now here we have Mom, who represents Preterism, Dad, who represents Futurism, and little Johnny with cookie crumbs and chocolate chips in the spaces between his teeth, smiling as his parents go at one another, trying to decide which one of Johnny's lies is true, both being self-evidently false, and Johnny, between them, clearly displaying the proof evidence. But the battle continues between Mom and Dad, Preterism and Futurism. The Futurists are convinced that God's hand is in the restoration of the modern nation state of Israel. God's hand is manifested by the fact that there are now Jews living in that land, especially because now they're in control of their own capital city, Jerusalem. They're not yet in control of Temple Mount, but that's coming. There's been no rapture. There's no temple built. There's no animal sacrifices. There have been Antichrist figures throughout this period, and yet no rapture. The things just aren't working out at all, and the futurists are beginning to abandon, says this author, the futurist belief. I say otherwise. I think they're hanging on to it with all their life. I don't see any change. in the futurists that I'm familiar with. But there's an argument raging between the futurist and the preterist, each criticizing the other's school of interpretation. And they think that if they prove the other wrong, then that automatically makes them right. Just like Mom, if she can prove that Johnny wasn't down at Jimmy's house, well then Johnny's first lie that he was in the shower holds sway. And then Dad, of course, trying to point out the error in Mom's thesis and support the thesis that Johnny was down to Jimmy's house during the time the cookies were allegedly taken, makes him automatically right. Neither one are interested in what's between Johnny's teeth. So the argument continues. The self-evident truth is ignored. That's how desperate the situation is in Christendom today. That is a very good analogy of how desperate the situation is with Christianity today. That's where we are today. So some futurists are abandoning futurism and joining the preterists. And the author continues now, he said, what has generated this recent interest in preterism? It appears that there have been an increased number of ministers, scholars, and writers who are producing books espousing the preterist viewpoint and pointing out the obvious errors and flaws of futurism. Perhaps there's also a growing number of pre-trib rapturists, which is just another word for futurists, who have become weary of not seeing some of their treasured prophecies come to pass, like the rapture, like this 7-year peace treaty, like the building of a temple and the establishment of the Jewish priesthood. None of those things have come to pass. And this is causing the futurists to look elsewhere for answers. Where do they think they're going to find them? Preterism, of course. They won't look at Johnny, who represents historicism, who's got the cookie crumbs and the chocolate chips between the spaces of his teeth. So they're abandoning futurism and going over to preterism. Well, it looks like Johnny must have been in the shower, despite the fact the shower's bone dry. Okay? He says, for example, the pre-trib rapturists, which literally means those who have the futurist interpretation of Daniel prophecy in view, the pre-trib rapturists taught that when the United Nations gave Palestine to the Jews in 1948, the rapture would occur, and that the last 7 years of the prophet Daniel's tribulation time clock would tick off. Okay? This would be the beginning of the 7-year period of time that Daniel supposedly prophesied in the future, totally ignoring that Jesus fulfilled that 7-year period of time 2,000 years ago, just as Daniel prophesied it, just as recorded in the New Testament. Okay? Daniel gave the prophecy, the history, the Christian history is recorded in the Gospels, records the fulfillment of it. Okay? This is the historical school of Bible interpretation, of prophecy interpretation. The prophet prophesies and history records. In this case, Daniel prophesied the coming of Messiah, a 7-year period of time in which he would restore. He would cause the sacrifices and oblations to cease and confirm the covenant with many, make reconciliation for sin. And the New Testament, the history book of the Christian church, records it. Prophecy, fulfillment. But in spite of the obvious evidence, the Christian world wants to argue about two different lies. Which lie is correct, futurism or preterism? No, they don't want to read their Bibles because the Bible doesn't talk about a rapture. We want to escape all this so-called 7-year Great Tribulation. I got news for you. There's been tribulation for God's people for 2,000 years. All that tribulation and testing and persecution and torture and murder and burnings at the stake and beheadings all came from the Roman Catholic Church, from the papacy. The martyrs of Jesus were martyred by the Roman Catholic Church. Persecution of the saints came from the Roman Catholic Church. 2,000 years of history. But we can't look at Johnny and admit that he's got cookies and chocolate chips between his teeth. We can't look directly at the self-evident evidence because we're too busy arguing about lies. What did the Bible say about delusion? That's it. That's it. The grand delusion. That's where we're at today. Deluded. The pre-tribulation rapturists, in other words, the futurists, taught that the United Nations gave Palestine to the Jews in 1948. The rapture would occur, and the last 7 years of the prophet Daniel's tribulation time clock would tick off. I got news for you. Daniel's time clock ticked off 1,000 years ago. That is the self-evident truth. He says, but 7 years passed, and another 7 years passed, and no rapture. Up until the time of this broadcast, how many 7-year periods of time have lapsed since 1948? Since 1967? How many 7-year periods of time have lapsed? And no rapture. And no tribulation, according to the futurists. He said, then they began to teach that for the Jews to really be in possession of the land, they must hold the capital city of Jerusalem. Okay? You see the hedging going on? The rapture didn't happen in 1948. Well, it's sure to happen in 1967 when the Jews got Jerusalem. How many 7-year periods of time have existed since then? It says this came about as a result of the 1967 war. Surely then the rapture would happen and the last 7 years of tribulation would tick off. History is a witness to what did not happen. You know why it didn't happen? Because it's not prophesied by God to happen. This is a false prophecy foisted upon the world by the Roman Catholic Church, by the papacy, and by her Jesuits. The perfect and complete fulfillment of that prophecy of Daniel 1,000 years ago in Jesus Christ. I know, I'm repeating myself over and over and over. But let me tell you, I can tell you from experience, that this lie, this delusion, which I held to for 50 years of my life, is nigh unto impossible to forget. It's difficult enough to learn something new, but it's nigh unto impossible to forget lifelong indoctrination and error. And the only way you're going to overcome this futurist lie is somebody tell you the truth over and over and over and over again. Otherwise, you'll do like I did for a number of years and had one foot in futurism and the other foot in historicism, and I remained confused. But there's no confusion in this. Just read Daniel's prophecy and then read the Gospels. Read the entire New Testament. You'll find the perfect and complete fulfillment. Not one element of Daniel's prophecy is left to be fulfilled. It was all fulfilled 2,000 years ago. Now, people are going to accuse me of being a preterist. That's nonsense. And after you read Daniel's prophecy and the New Testament, you'll see that that accusation is nonsense. Especially the fact that the preterists believe that the Antichrist was one of the Caesars of the old Roman Empire. That the Antichrist was done away with no later than 410 AD at the fall of the pagan Roman Empire. No, I'm a historicist. We have the historical proof of the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy in Jesus Christ alone, the one for whom Daniel prophesied. Daniel prophesied, Jesus fulfilled. It's just as simple as that. And when you can see that with your own eyes, the preterists all of a sudden become a laughingstock to you. And the futurists become the greatest deceivers since the Garden of Eden. All right, as a result of these miscalculations, it appears that some teachers, preachers, and other knowledgeable individuals of the pre-trib futurist school have concluded that there was undoubtedly something amiss with their eschatology, and they're looking into another viewpoint. Okay, maybe we're getting somewhere. The futurists are finally beginning to admit to themselves they made a mistake somewhere. You got to be able to admit that you've made a mistake before you can find a solution, right? The trouble is the futurists are jumping right out of the futurist the futurist frying pan and right into the preterist fire. They're not looking at historicism, the ancient belief of Christians from the first century till upwards of 250 years ago, before preterism or futurism got a foothold in the Protestant churches. Okay, we've got in the Protestant churches, we've got the blind leading the blind. We've got wolves in sheep's clothing running the churches in this country. Somebody's got to set them straight. And one voice isn't going to do it. Okay? The author continues, he says, both the futurists and the preterists spare no words in attacking the other's position. They've been at odds for years, but the verbal fisticuff seems to have intensified during the past decade. Their thinking seems to be that if they can prove the other wrong, then that automatically proves their position to be correct. Not true. The historicists believe they are both in error. We don't just believe they're both in error. We know they are in error. We know what Christians believed from the first century up until preterism and futurism began to be taught in the Protestant seminaries, the Protestant colleges, the Protestant universities. We know what they believed. They were absolutely irrefutable in the facts that they revealed to the world, and that the whole Christian world today has abandoned that truth to embrace fables. Diabolically inspired fables. Craftily devised fables. Preterism and futurism are diabolically devised lies, fables. Restore the historicist truth, the historicist understanding. But start by reading Daniel's prophecy in chapter 9, the 70-week prophecy, and see its literal fulfillment in the New Testament. Start there, and then everything else will fall into place. If you leave that undone, if you fail to read and understand Daniel's prophecy, and if you fail to read and understand the New Testament and see its perfect and complete fulfillment in Jesus Christ in His 7-year ministry on the earth, then you're still subject to deception, whether it be preterism or futurism or any other cockamamie malarkey that the papacy can come up with to exonerate itself of the accusation and the onus of Antichrist. You cannot come out of this delusion until you read Daniel's prophecy and see its perfect and complete fulfillment in the New Testament. And if you're unwilling to do that, then you've wasted all your time and mine. All right, what did the early church believe. What is historicism? And what evidence and facts do we have to back up what we know to be true? From now on, the discussion is going to be about historicism. We've proved the laughingstock that preterism is. We've proved the diabolical lie that futurism is. Now we're going to talk about the truth. How refreshing. Historicism, the faith of our fathers. In the following pages, numerous quotations from distinguished authors and church scholars will be found. Because of their schooling and the unique positions in history, they have earned the right to speak with authority on this subject. Historicism is a viewpoint that dates back to the earliest centuries of the Christian church, but seems to be almost forgotten today among the opposing schools of prophetic interpretation. Who are the opposing schools of Bible prophecy interpretation? Preterism and Futurism. Okay? Preterism and Futurism are the only schools of Bible prophecy that have been studied in this country for nigh unto 200 years. The word historicism is never mentioned. The idea that the papacy is the Antichrist is never mentioned anymore. When it was the predominant knowledge for 2,000 years prior. Okay? Historicism is a viewpoint that dates back to the earliest centuries of the church. And this author is going to prove, as we've done so many times here on Inquisition Update, that the historicist school of Bible prophecy interpretation was held by the first century church. Why? Because they knew Daniel's prophecy and they saw it fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Real time. They were there. They were eyewitnesses. Now, if Jesus be the Christ, then who is the Antichrist? Paul plainly told him, he who now letteth will let until he be taken out of the way, and then that man of sin will be revealed. Well, who was reigning at the time Paul spoke? The Caesars. The ones who were ruling over the Roman Empire. The ones who crucified our Christ, together with their Jewish brethren. Okay, when the Caesars are taken out of the way, then that man of sin will be revealed. The son of perdition. And history leaves no possibility for that to be anyone other than the papacy. So they saw Paul's prophecy fulfilled right before their very eyes in history. God's prophets prophesy, and history records. If they can blind you to the prophecies as they did to Jews and forbid them to read Daniel's prophecy, then you miss the Messiah when he comes. Because Daniel gave the perfect timeline for his coming. You could count off the calendar days until Jesus would be baptized in the River Jordan by John the Baptist. 483 years from the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, altogether 69 weeks of years. 483 years. And there were people who read and understand Daniel's prophecy who were waiting for the Messiah. They were actively looking for the Messiah because they believed and understood Daniel's prophecy. They were looking for the historical fulfillment. There is no historical fulfillment in the preterist interpretation of Bible prophecy. There is no historical fulfillment in the futurist interpretation of Bible prophecy. Historicism is the only correct, the only candidate for correctness in Bible prophecy interpretation. So we're going to give numerous quotes from distinguished authors of the church scholars, and because of their schooling or their unique positions in history, they have earned the right to speak with authority on the subject of historicism. the Protestant interpretation of Bible prophecy. He says historicism is a viewpoint that dates back to the earliest centuries of the church, but seems to be almost forgotten today among the opposing schools of prophetic interpretation, that is, Preterism and Futurism. There is a plethora of material espousing Futurism, an abundance of books promoting Preterism, but scant mention anywhere of historicism today. And I say from today forward, all of that should change. Preterism and Futurism must go into the ash bin of history, to the shame of God's people. And we ought to all be on our knees, on our faces before the Lord, and admit our error so that He can correct us. And then we must return to historicism. God's prophets prophesy. History records their fulfillment. Now let's study prophecy and how those prophecies were fulfilled in history. The author continues, he says, in 1887, note the time, this was roughly 70 years after Preterism and Futurism, particularly Futurism, was being taught in Protestant England. Futurism was becoming the orthodox teaching in the Protestant schools, churches, and universities in England. 70 years later, Dr. Henry Grattan Guinness, a doctor of divinity and a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, an English scholar, preacher, writer, and lecturer, wrote the book, Romanism and the Reformation from the Standpoint of Prophecy. Romanism and the Reformation from the Standpoint of Prophecy. We're going to see what Henry Grattan Guinness says in that book tomorrow on the broadcast. Don't miss it. It'll open your eyes just as it opened mine. A precious, precious book. We'll see you tomorrow.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn, the Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the Scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.